Welcome to the Touching into Presence podcast.
This podcast is for people who are interested in bodywork, empowerment, and somatic-based practices.
I am Nikki Olson.
I'm Andrew Rosenstock.
We are certified rolfers.
Collectively, we're trained in various movement and bodywork therapies with an emphasis on somatic awareness and client resilience.
Through conversations, our goal is to share and explore mind-body paradigms to offer empowerment possibilities.
It was a pleasure to be in conversation with Daniel Simpson. Daniel is the author of The Truth of Yoga, a comprehensive guide to yoga, history, and philosophy. His approach is engaging and fun, making scholarly knowledge accessible and relevant to modern practitioners. Daniel holds a master's degree in yoga studies from SOAS, University of London, and teaches courses at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies on yoga teacher trainings and online. In today's conversation, we spoke about the history of yoga, the historical appropriations through the age of various yogas, classical yoga as embodied practice, similar frameworks of phenomenology in yoga and rolfing, lineages and traditions, as well as excerpts from his wonderful new book and why Truth of Yoga is a great place between academia and laymanship. Find out more about Daniel and his book at truthofyoga.com, as well as the Amazon link in the episode description. And you can find out info on his courses at danielsimpson.info. So with that, let's begin our talk. Hey, Daniel. I'm in the middle of your book right now, and I'm really looking forward to recommending it to people to be like, here, learn something.
Oh, well, thanks. I'm glad it gives you that impression. The working title for it was Yoga Without the Bullshit. And it got spun round to be The Truth of Yoga. But it was to try and say that a whole tradition of ideas associated with this practice that have absolutely nothing to do with repeating affirmations in front of the bathroom mirror and other such new age delusions, magical thinking, etc., etc. And instead, I think people have used the feeling that they get within themselves to rationalize gut instincts. We all get funny feelings about the way the world is, but that's not necessarily the most skillful use of the grey matter between the ears to make sense of information.
Yeah. I mean, I think actually that's enough. We can end the podcast right there. That sums it all.
Fair enough.
No. I guess as far as starting out, one of my hopes, what I was hoping to do is yoga is a huge topic, but a lot of it was sort of about the embodiment piece. I remember when I learned, like in particular, the Bhuta Shuddhi practices and understanding the embodied practices of yoga, which were not just like these physical asanas created less than 100 years ago, but there's other pieces and maybe dive into some of that. I don't know if there's like how you would want to organize things. I think starting with like about you would obviously make sense.
I'm absolutely happy to go wherever things take us. I've got all sorts of things I can say, but let's see what you'd like to hear about, and we'll just go from there.
Cool. Well, one thing I want to share for people listening is how awesome your book is.
Thank you.
And what I've really enjoyed, I mean, I've read a bunch of I've read Mallinson's books and I've read articles of him, and Mallinson is amazing and ingenious, but he's very academic, and so sometimes I read a page and I have to take a nap. And I've read other books that are less academic and read really easily, but maybe leave me feeling a little bit of like, what is the accuracy here? And what I've loved about your book is it has that academic. It has you have the credentials. And the way you write is very academic, but there's also this playfulness and easiness, and it really straddles the line. And so I think it makes it really easy for people who maybe are have done a little bit of yoga training and want to know more, but don't want to get bogged down. And it's just this beautiful bridge across. That's how I found it to be.
I'm so happy to hear you say that. I mean, that was my aspiration in writing the book. And I guess, there's two aspects to my background that made it come together that way. I have studied yoga academically. I've had the great fortune to study with people like Jim Mallinson, Mark Singleton, right at the cutting edge, Jason Birch, also, the forefront of research on the history of yoga as a physical practice, really looking in the modern era, what's happened in the last 100 years, which has been very innovative from the point of view of what's taught as yoga. Before that, the emergence of increasingly complex systems of physical yoga practice. And even way before that, just the very birthplace of yoga as something to do with the body, because for many, many years, perhaps more than half of yoga's history, it's been a seated practice about transcending the body rather than working with the body. So I've really had the benefit of their wisdom in helping me to see clearly. But as you say, they're scholars. They write for each other primarily. They're pushing the boundaries of knowledge. So they're engaged in that project. They're happy to talk to the general public, and when they do speak clearly. But they don't write their academic papers that way. And so I've wanted to share that knowledge with the broader yoga community. I'm a yoga practitioner. I'm a yoga teacher as well. But before all of this, I was a journalist. So my basic professional skill set is immerse myself in a topic for a period of time and try to come back with the clearest, most accurate summary that I can possibly put together. And in my book, I've done that with, maybe 100 different topics, tried to say, well, if you could only read 500 words on the subject, these ones are going to count. And then if you want to go further, obviously you need to read more. I'm not the overall authority, but my aim was to make a sort of big picture story more accessible about how yoga has developed from its earliest origins to all of the things that are now called yoga, and then provide all the jumping off points for people to see, where they could go further with that, and also to understand how what people talk about today as cultural appropriation or the mixing and matching of things in ways that aren't necessarily traditional is actually the process by which yoga has developed throughout its history. Different ideas have been combined, rearranged, remixed, large elements of them discarded, and then other things have come back into fashion again. And you can see those trends throughout history. So in a way, it is authentic to do that, but one has to have some concern for tradition. So I wanted to show what the yoga tradition has said about itself and enable modern practitioners then, I guess, to develop their own relationship with that material and to feel that they can do that authentically, without at the same time feeling tied down to take one text and try and behave like somebody from 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's awesome. Especially, I just had a conversation about the appropriation with someone the other day in regards to a longer story, but they thinking that the West has appropriated yoga, and I was like, but yoga has been appropriating yoga for years. Like within the South Asian continent, or I wouldn't even say India, has been appropriating within itself. That's how it grew. That's how so much of it did. And we did not see eye to eye in the end of it, but that's okay. I can send them your book, and maybe they will learn a little more.
I have some choice words to say in the closing chapters about this whole debate around appropriation and also sometimes the hidden agendas of people who are very interested in having that discussion. There's an attempt, particularly in India and amongst members of the Indian diaspora, to assert ownership of yoga for reasons connected to Hindu nationalism. And it's important, I think, that, concerned, well-meaning, liberal-minded modern yoga practitioners don't get their ear bent too much by these people so that they start adopting those talking points. It's for sure important to be concerned about the way in which white people, particularly Brits, have exploited the Indian subcontinent and to therefore be mindful of the echo of that in the way that some yoga teachers repackage things to the point that they're unrecognizable from their Indian inspiration, strip out all the Hinduism, strip out the Indian context, and then make a load of money out of it and call it yoga. Clearly that's going to annoy some people. That's okay, but it doesn't mean you have to take dictation about dubious explanations of history that enable modern Indian politicians to mistreat minorities. That's not very helpful.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was just curious. So I've dabbled in yoga, and I would say I would be more a asana practitioner. That I really came out of it for more of the physical rewards and not so much the physical and the mind body. But I never really went. I guess I would say I wasn't so invested to, learn all the history and the mantras and and all that. And so I've always kind of found myself as I talk and say, oh, I'm certified in yoga, I'm very blunt about the fact that like I practiced asana and I did the beach certification, the 200-hour great beach training. And then later I did do training with T.S. Little and a little bit more of the therapeutics. But and I'm very curious to read a little bit more of your book. I saw that little clip of yoga that you have on your website, Yoga in a Minute. And I was like, that's great. And, but I like to ask the question, do you think in the Western world right now, are we practicing yoga, or have people just marketed off the asana practice?
Well, it's an excellent question. And I mean, it has been commoditized and packaged in such a way that there are people who are being taught things in gyms that have absolutely nothing to do with the philosophical tradition that yoga developed from, or the original objectives of yoga, which are to do ultimately with reducing and ideally eliminating suffering. That had all sorts of explanations that were quite esoteric in terms of avoiding being reborn, the whole process by which one might do that involving effectively renouncing the world. But fundamentally, that was the objective. And most people today are in some ways looking for that. I think we do all sorts of things in modern life that aren't very helpful sometimes to try and avoid future suffering. But that's not often what people are looking for from, a workout. And they're just looking to feel better in their bodies or to look better in their bodies. And that's the way in for a lot of people to an embodied movement-based practice that may sometimes be marketed as yoga. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I do think we have to question, is there a point to which things, can evolve beyond which they're not really yoga? Because some things today are called yoga. I've seen recently things like rage yoga, which basically just involves shouting, sticking the middle finger up at people. And I'm sure that feels very cathartic, but I don't really see how that has a connection with anything else that's been called yoga in the past. But moving in the body has been a thing in the yoga tradition now for quite a few hundred years. And was part of the practice of martial artists, wrestlers, dancers, and there's a lot of crossover between these movement disciplines in Indian history that's barely understood, and scholars are really working on that now, trying to see those intersections. So it's not new for people to think, well, this practice of moving the body in these particular ways, perhaps, at least with a bit of focus on what I'm doing and maybe even focus on the breath at the same time, that's pretty traditional, even if you're not thinking about the philosophical context or the ultimate aim of, eliminating suffering, and you're just doing the practice. And that's been done and called yoga for some time. So I do think that's a very valid way in, but it does come down to, are you paying attention? The practice of yoga, really, if we're really going to try and sort of define it at the most sort of helicopter level, flying as high as we can above everything that falls under the label yoga, training in attention seems to be the common factor. And physical yoga practice has a connection to the older meditative approaches to yoga if it encourages what the texts call one-pointed focus. So concentration, really. Concentration on an object, the object being the shape being made in the body, becoming aware of the movement of the body in space, not just sort of mindlessly flailing around. And most of the way that yoga is taught today encourages that, whether one's looking for it or not. It's an accidental byproduct, and that tends to cultivate a quieter state of mind and perhaps an inclination to approach life a little more meditatively, and then other things start to arise.
So with that being said, what would be the point of differentiation to like another historical movement like martial arts? I mean, that's a lot of training with intention and the kind of finding your center. And
well, these practices are tools. Yeah. And I think, obviously the name says it all with martial art. It's using this mastery over the mind and the body ultimately to become a very effective weapon. But in most systems of martial arts, that's sort of something way over the horizon that isn't really part of the point of the training. The training is its own end because it brings about that mastery. So it's almost the art of fighting by not fighting, becoming so skilled in fighting that no fighting will ever be needed. And that's a different project, I think, to the yoga practice. Although it's a very blurry boundary between the two, in the sense that there are traditional yogis who were mercenaries, who were using this transcendence of the world, of the body, mastery over the elements within themselves, to be fearless wielders of weapons, for money. And some of them fought the British when the British were trying to establish the East India Company in the 18th century in India. Some of them were hired by the British to fight back against other bands of these naked ascetics, because the British imperial project was a very light touch thing. Not very many people were exported from the West to run the country. The genius or the evil malevolence of it all was to enlist locals in the project. But locals were quite fearful of these naked holy men wielding weapons and refused to fight them. So these mercenaries were quite a problem. And as a result of that, physical yoga practice got demonized under British colonial occupation. It got pushed to the margins. We have a lot of texts about physical yoga from maybe the 12th, 13th century. They start to appear, but really, really proliferating for the next 500 years or so. And then physical yoga practice in the last 200-300 years, if we discount the 20th century, was on the fringes again. And it was something that I think, for those political reasons, the British had a good interest in marginalising, but also Indians, again, under colonial occupation, took a lot of this on board and thought of yoga as a more spiritual, philosophical practice that should be distant somewhat from these physical practices. And then early Westerners who took an interest in yoga had a similar perspective. The Theosophical Society, for example, involved in translating quite a few tantric and yogic texts in the late 19th century, early 20th century, were primarily interested in the cultivation of power in the body, meditative practices, visualizations, the harnessing of inner flows of energy, but not in making shapes with the body. That was just something that the weird roadside beggars did. And the characteristic example being what we would refer to as somebody who sits around on a bed of nails. That was the classic demonization. This is a layabout, wastrel, good for nothing, who's basically a circus trickster. And some yogis then wound up trying to make a living as contortionists, performing on stage, coming to London in the 19th century to Victorian music halls and showing off their ability to stick their legs behind their head, in the same way that Western circus contortionists were doing that sort of thing. So physical yoga, I think, only really got rehabilitated in the early 20th century as a mass movement. And at that point, Indians were interested in exercise. So the combination of traditional yoga practices, cultivation of the body, and very much worldly aims, feeling better, looking good, getting ahead in your professional career while sort of being calm and clear about what you're doing. Those were ideas that were cultivated in early 20th century India in an attempt to make yoga seem modern, scientific, and rational, and to show ultimately, firstly to the British, we're not primitive. We've got a very sophisticated system of physical training of our own, and secondly, to really encourage Indians to strengthen themselves and to resist colonial occupation. Some early yoga teachers in the 20th century talking about that in those terms. So it's a very tangled web. It's very difficult sometimes actually to see the distinction between modern Western versions of this and what's happened 100 years earlier. It's just obviously it's happened in India then, so it is slightly different. But the real difference, I think, is between physical yoga and everything that went before 1500 years prior to this emergence of doing stuff with the body. Because previously the body was an obstacle and it was to be ignored, effectively, beaten into submission or contorted into a difficult position and left there forever, like holding an arm above your head for decades or standing on one leg, doing something really, really uncomfortable. basically until the body's screaming at you, like, this hurts, stop, so that you detach from it and don't give in to it. And that's the transcendence of desire. That's the transcendence of engagement with the world. That's self-mastery by disappearing. And for a lot of the early history of yoga, that was the project and that was the means. And that's obviously very different. And you wouldn't get very far trying to sell that to modern yoga practitioners. And thankfully, other things have happened to evolve the practice since then.
And was it largely the introduction of the tantric practices that made it less of a? My understanding is before that the yogis were more or less renunciates. They renunciated the world, which means you couldn't have a family, you couldn't exist relatively in the world because you're trying to escape from it. And it was largely the introduction of the tantric practices where they were saying, instead of let's escape, it was like how do we live within the world and transcend?
Yes, I think you're broadly right. Tantric philosophy certainly changed people's relationship to the body. The body was no longer an obstacle. The body was something that could be harnessed. It was ultimately, a vehicle for spiritual development, and therefore should be cultivated, should be transformed, should be seen actually as a portal to divinity. Therefore not something to beat into submission, to leave behind. And, really, ultimately, the early yogis were fast forwarding to the end of this life in the hope that they wouldn't come back. So instead of that, Tantra was saying, well, everything here in this life can be used as fuel for waking up, because it's all just a flow of energy. And so long as we understand how that works correctly, then that can be liberating. But the enemy, in a sense, the adversary, the potential downfall for the practitioner is still the same thing. It's the problem of desire. And Tantra develops a new relationship with desire, saying, well, we can use desire to transcend desire, but that's a very delicate balance to strike. The problem of desire is that it gets us hung up on things to the extent that we become effectively addicted to them. At the most basic level, we want more of the things we like and we want to avoid the things we don't like. And that puts us in a difficult relationship with reality, because reality is constantly denying us the things that we want and making us live with stuff that we would never have chosen, like what's happened to most of us the last year. So the original yogic philosophical worldview was stop trying to control anything. In fact, stop trying to have any interaction with the world. There will be no desire. There will be no problem of suffering. And Tantra was saying, well, actually, no, okay, you just need to be more skillful with seeing what's going on, allowing desire to flow through us, perhaps even enjoying, but not craving more, being okay with it coming and going. And ultimately being okay with things coming and going is the yogic state, because that's reality. Things come and go. This body comes and goes. No amount of cultivating it is going to prevent that. Although people are at work in Silicon Valley trying to wire us up to machines to change that story, maybe they'll succeed and we'll have another tantric style revolution in how we relate to the body. But sort of at the basic level, yes, that was what changed things. But before that, though, there were seeds of something different. The Bhagavad Gita being the most influential yoga text in this respect, saying, well, you can't really renounce the world. It's actually impossible unless you're basically going to kill yourself. Then activity happens. The body is doing things every moment to sustain itself. The instinct to stay alive is very strong, and at the same time, then the question arises, what are we going to do with that? Well, we can be of no use to anybody whatsoever, sitting in the cave trying to transcend, or we can try to actually be liberated in the process of doing things and try to see how to use this embodied existence in a skillful way. Now, the Bhagavad Gita has its own sort of political context story and the problems of managing a hierarchical society, basically a caste system. If everybody is interested in sort of stepping away from that hierarchical society because they see through it and see it as a source of their suffering, they all want to go and live in a cave, then there'll be nobody left to do the dirty work that enables the priests to carry on sitting on top of the pile. So there's a certain context that suggests that priests found a way to make all of this world-renouncing stuff compatible with staying in society and thereby ensured their own perpetuation. But I think philosophically, though, it was a very skillful move because there are benefits to becoming less hung up on the outcomes of actions, which was the basic teaching of the Bhagavad Gita, doing things for the sake of doing them without expecting personal gain. And if the problem is this sort of endless attempts to satisfy ourselves, to put ourselves at the center of the universe, and to try and organize reality in such a way that we feel served by everything and get what we want all the time, we don't tend to live very harmoniously with others. We're exploiting them and trampling all over them, or refusing to accept our limits. And so I think those are the seeds, really, of a more realistic relationship with reality that developed into tantric religion. An understanding of divinity permeating everything. In the 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna reveals himself as all things in the universe, and it's a religious text. The title Bhagavad Gita means God's song, and that can be a bit sort of off-putting to some Western practitioners, but it's actually really psychedelic. I mean, Krishna is just sort of showing the absolute unlimited nature of energetic phenomena pulsating constantly with past, present, and future. Just depending on how you look at it, how time is arranged. He's saying, I am time. I am the creation of the cycle of everything. Here is all things happening at once, past, present, and future, revealed right now. It's like sensory overload, the inability of the mental filters to function that stop us from walking around in psychedelic chaos 24/7. And when we see the world from that perspective, it's blatantly clear that we're totally insignificant configurations of energy and matter here right now at this moment, but we'll soon pass. And there's all manner of other configurations too. Why should we prioritize any of it? If we want to be worshipping anything, we should just worship all of it, because it's all potentially us, and we're all each other anyway. And so tantric philosophy grew out of that, I think, although tantric traditions like to say they invented the whole story. I think there were plenty of seeds they were working with.
Yeah, that's beautiful. For me, when I got into yoga, it's sort of similar, like Nikki was saying, it was very actually physical. And even I remember in my first training, I left being like, this is great, but that philosophy stuff, I don't need that. And later in time, I think each subsequent training, being a little more interested in the philosophy. And I think part of the reason I struggled with the philosophy at first was because my teachers were great and they were sharing what they knew, but it never made sense. And it didn't make sense because they had different stories upon different stories, as was common for a lot of the yoga things. You hear something and it makes sense, and you hear it from a certain perspective. But it wasn't until much later, largely when I accidentally took a 2-week training with Carlos, that the universe kind of plopped in my lap. That the way he explained stuff, it was sort of like, oh, that's why that doesn't fit with there, and that's a misunderstanding there. Oh, the chakras are really just a confabulation of Jung. That's great. Well, they're not, but the way that we teach them are. And so slowly going into that, and yoga really led me into more into phenomenology. And interestingly, so Nikki and I are both rolfers, and rolfing has a lot of phenomenology, or it can have a lot of phenomenology put into that. What are we working with people? How does an embodied being relate to the world? And so for me, when I would talk to people and they would say, well, what do you do? And I'd say, well, I'm a yoga teacher, a yoga therapist, and I'm also a structural body worker. I do rolfing. And they'd say, well, isn't that very different? And I'd say, well, no. I mean, to me, both are working with nature and reality as it's unfolding, whether it's a physical body and stuck in a movement, or a thought stuck in a movement, or other. These are all just, to me, they're really the same. But the problem is that my view of reality and most people's view of reality doesn't quite align.
There's a big problem with yoga philosophy when we're trying to make sense of it as Westerners. We haven't grown up with an exposure to Indian tradition, most of us, or if we have, it's usually been through various New Age prisms. As you were describing there with the whole story of chakras, they've been reinvented even since Carl Jung. The whole association with rainbow colors is perhaps only 30 or 40 years old. All manner of remixes of ideas. So there's that problem, but more to the point, there are many philosophies of yoga. There isn't one. There's not some pure tradition from which everything else has descended. There are lots of different explanations that have arisen at different moments for different reasons. Some of them harmoniously fit together, others completely contradict each other, and that just can't be made to go away. And yet, in Indian tradition, texts have just combined them as if there's no problem, to the point it's very hard to separate them. And modern Western teachers will talk as if, yoga means union, it's got 8 limbs, and it's all about chakras. And those 3 things come from completely different phases of history, different philosophies, and utterly incompatible, frankly. But they've become that way, and what to do? That's how people understand things. So part of my attempt in writing the book has been to disentangle these things and to show how each have their own context and then have been put together, and we can engage in that. But the benefit of looking at yoga philosophy really is first of all, just to see that the problems that affect the body are often in the mind and vice versa. And obviously, as body workers, you understand that. That's what you're working with. But until relatively recently, that was not a common idea in the West. The chief villain is usually suggested as being René Descartes, his idea, I think, therefore I am, total obsession with the mind, not really that much interest in the body, as if if we could cultivate our minds enough, we wouldn't even need a body. And the yoga tradition has always seen mind and body as inherently linked. In fact, the distinction in a lot of yoga philosophy is between the mind and body and something else that is the witness of what's happening in the mind and the body. And I think a lot of problems of human experience make a lot of sense within our own embodied experience if we start to look at them that way. If we get ourselves caught up in the thoughts in our head or the pain we have in parts of the body, then that just amplifies it. If we're able to somehow experience our embodiment without identifying with the contents of the mind or the feelings in the body and just allowing them to be present, something else starts to happen. And I think yoga philosophy provides a really fertile ground for exploring that. But the other thing that I think is very different in recent history is we didn't have tools for explaining this internal experience until very recently. I was reading, there's a book called The Path of Modern Yoga by Elliot Goldberg that came out about 5 years ago, and one of the many scholarly books on which I drew to write my summary. And he points out there with quite a lot of interesting detail the origination of the concept of what we call proprioception, which is really a sort of an understanding of the body's movement from the inside as it's present in space. And the guy who came up with that idea was presenting it, barely 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago. And there wasn't language for this until then. And after that point, there was suddenly proliferation in mind-body therapies, modalities. Perhaps probably the most famous coming at the early days of the Alexander technique, having a lot of influence on perhaps even the teaching of yoga, certainly in terms of physical instructions, put this there and try to sort of deal with the problems of the mind through the body. So that's relatively new. But then at the same time, back in yoga history, there are these texts talking about inner experience, sometimes visualizing it. I mean, that was the original function of chakras. They're not there in the body and they don't have particular properties. They're templates for meditative visualization. And that was the whole process of tantric embodied practice, was to get very subtle in the experience of embodiment, and then very ritually to install mantras, visions, energetic qualities associated with the divine in different places, very specifically, to remake the body effectively, symbolically deconstruct it and then reconstruct it. But that provided a language for talking about internal experience that was obviously very appealing, and that's why chakras got, I guess, misappropriated and misrepresented. But there's also before that even language. Modern mindfulness teachers make use of a discourse given by the Buddha, getting on for 2,500 years ago, in which he describes mindfulness of the body and speaks in great detail about a sense of embodied experience and using that as a way of training attention. And it's not really just the simple level of the way it's presented today as, just pay attention while brushing your teeth or doing the washing up. It's pay real attention to the nature of this body and the fact that it's basically, a collection of fluids in this container that's quite leaky that will eventually burst and be no use any longer. And that'll be the end of it. So clearly it's not something to get too attached to. It's part of that project of seeing through the illusion of the body that all the early yoga practitioners were into, and the Buddha and early yoga are very strongly connected. But at the same time, he's saying through an awareness of that, you can any day, any moment of the day, get a clear understanding of who you are through the body. So the body was seen there as a tool. It wasn't. Buddha tried some crazy ascetic stuff like starving himself or holding his breath and to the point of blacking out, and said that's just self-torture. That's not going to help. But he was still fairly austere, and at the same time had a language for being mindful of embodied existence. And there's a sort of current from that point forwards of talking about this, and yoga texts pick up on it a little bit to talk about we experience suffering through the body. There's a metaphor in the great Indian epic, the Mahabharata, of there being a knot in the heart. And this is probably one of the earliest references to what becomes chakra systems. And if we can untie this knot, there'll be great happiness. If we could just think about what it is to be depressed, closed in, compared to this sort of emanation of loving energy and just complete at easeness, if that's really a word, with the way things are, then there is no problem. And through the body, therefore, the problems of the mind can be resolved. So there are these hints. And I don't think we have that in certainly Western philosophical traditions until more recently, with the advent of tools like phenomenology to actually give it some sort of, scientific even footing for being discussed. But still, science is quite skeptical of the idea of first person experience being something that can be the basis for drawing, more broader conclusions. But from a practitioner's perspective or from a healer's perspective, this is obviously, very, very powerful. It's a way of having a relationship with somebody that can be therapeutic.
Well, for someone who hasn't, I've always felt with yoga or the asana practice with it, and the active movement I've always kind of felt in touch with the tradition, even though it's not something I spent a lot of time studying. I've read a few books here and there. Maybe I've had a few teachers that, gave a really great soundbite of the tradition right before the practice and would dabble it through. Because then often there's the people who, are just turned 20 and then all of a sudden did a 200-hour training, and then they are these great philosophers. And so I've had this kind of ebbs and flows of going into studios and practicing because, I find teachers that I really like or it's a convenient studio, but then I can also feel very turned off into the actual practice. But when I'm at home and doing it, there is something really beautiful, I think, of the asanas and just going in through movement, and they're not very complex. Like, I'm not a person who's like throwing my feet behind my head or getting in those crazy advanced positions. And I just feel like it's such a powerful tool of becoming in line with yourself and feeling the bliss of movement and how it feels good. And then also the parts of that don't feel good, but you're staying present and you're learning tolerance of suffering and things like that. And then for me, who I taught at the Rolf Institute, so I've seen a lot of students come through and also been part of other kind of mind, body, movement practices. I feel like yoga is kind of a gateway, like the gateway drug into some kind of higher, I won't say higher because I don't want to put it on this pedestal, but in a way to start enriching their knowledge in these mind-body practices that isn't necessarily going and becoming a yoga scholar. But I feel like it is, but there's always that nugget that's like in their bodies that brings them into, whether it's a rolfing practice or even massage or somatic work, martial arts. I mean, would you agree, or is that just my own little kind of soapbox on?
No, I think
honor the tradition without reading all the books.
I mean, it's very possible to get lost in the mind through the study of yoga texts. The problem for most of the history of yoga has been we get lost in the mind, we get confused about our identity, and we get attached to the wrong things and form unhelpful conclusions about ourselves and the world as a result. And we can do that through studying yoga texts. We can do that through physical practice. It's also possible to practice in a very dissociative way. I've spent a lot of time around quite advanced practitioners of Ashtanga yoga, and there are some, but not suggest that this is exclusive to Ashtanga, but I guess it's the context in which I've seen it. Some people who use that practice as a way of punishing themselves. And so they perhaps have, there's a lot of disordered eating because there's a lot of trying to make sure that the body is completely empty so that you can contort it to the max early in the morning. So basically, don't eat after a certain time. Being very concerned about what you put in. And there's a lot of, sort of control issues that can easily develop, and actually therefore not being so focused on being present to embodied experience, trying to master the body and beat it into submission. It's almost more like asceticism. I don't want to sound like I've got it in for that practice. I've practiced Ashtanga style yoga quite a lot. I've taught some of it as well, and I think it's a great tool. But all these things are tools. It depends how we use them. We can use them skillfully, or we can use them unhelpfully. And the way you were describing asana practice sounded to me very skillful. It sounded like what has happened in the West, that the best teachers have found a way to encode philosophical truths in the practice of these physical postures that are profound. And the problem of suffering really consists of not being willing to tolerate the discomfort of being alive. Life is not all peachy, and things happen that we don't like. And as you just articulated, if it's possible to tolerate things that are a little bit uncomfortable as an embodied practice in a way that is careful, boundaried, it's not, I'm going to subject myself to lots of agony and potentially damage myself, but that I'm not going to run away from a little bit of discomfort. I'm going to learn to breathe in such a way as it can potentially even dissolve. That's an exportable skill, something that becomes part of day-to-day life. And no amount of reading yoga texts is necessarily going to help one to acquire that, whereas embodied experience does. And so I think that's one of the gifts of modern postural yoga when skillfully taught. It makes this stuff really accessible. Of course, if one then wants to go further with it and really make sure one's on the right path, one needs to think about ideas that maybe don't get mentioned in a class to see, what skillfulness really consists of. Am I basically compounding my suffering by adding to this process whereby I confuse myself and basically strengthen my sense of attachment to self-gratification? Or am I getting better at being able to ride the waves of reality? Because reality is going to keep having waves. That's just the nature of reality. No amount of trying to control it will ever succeed, unfortunately. But we can get some control over how we respond to it. And I think yoga is a really good tool for teaching us that. And as you were articulating, you can learn that through an asana practice without really thinking about the terminology. But it needs to be taught that way. It needs to encourage presence. And there's a lot of teaching that doesn't. One of the bugbears for me is playing loud music, and some people find that helpful. They bliss out to the movement and the soundtrack, but are not necessarily very focused on their embodied experience, are more dissociating from it. And yet others will tell me the exact opposite. They find that very grounding because it takes them out of their heads and enables them to be in their body, in the same way that some find chanting a mantra helpful in that way, and others find it really off-putting and somehow like they're they're spouting somebody else's religious gobbledygook. That doesn't feel very comfortable. And also, the cultural appropriation police will definitely get on your case if you start using that language, as I just did.
Well, I shared that because in my experience as being a personal trainer, there's times where I'd be working with a client and knew that or could see that their body would really benefit from a particular, essentially, stretch. And from being in yoga classes, I knew, all these different postures. And I would have these clients that would be, I don't do yoga. I don't like yoga. I'm not going to do yoga. And then I would put them in this position and I would just kind of cue them in how to be. Didn't call it any particular thing. And they would get into whatever thing that I thought they needed to be in. And they would hold it and they're like, oh God, it feels good. And I always would think of like, when I would hear this, and I don't know if this is still the truth in yoga, but asanas practice helps open up, channels in your body or lines. And so they always come to mind. And, after a while of, doing that, they'd be like, oh, can we do that stretch again? That just felt so good. I could feel it throughout the day. And later they're like, what is this? They'd always think that like, I'm like creating these things. I'm like, no, you just did yoga. You did a yoga pose. And they're like, what? So it would just always be so funny that putting these people who are like, absolutely, I don't do yoga. Those are for those weird hippies. This is kind of some people I would work with in New York City. And, yeah, it was just always fun to kind of put them in these positions and they would feel this openness. And it wasn't just, their hip flexors felt better. There was this energetic charge that they would feel. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I was going at with, I feel like the tradition, whether you're studying it or not, or really into it, it comes through in the movements.
The body can be experienced in so many ways. I mean, there's a very gross experience of embodiment of just sort of knowing you've got parts and you can put them in places. But there's a feeling within that, an energetic flow, and paying attention deliberately to where these sort of external bits and pieces are placed makes it easier for there to be a free flow inside. And on the most sort of basic level, I think that's how yoga practice cues us into an energetic experience of being embodied. And there's an explanation of that. And it's called prana in the yoga philosophical context. And that's one of the oldest ideas that there is. It predates yoga. From at least 3,000 years ago, described in one of the Vedas as the sort of foundation of all existence, referring partly to breath and just this sort of vitality, the experience of being alive. And of course, modern scientists would say, well, we can't categorize this concept, therefore it doesn't really exist. It's just a sort of an imagination of an experience. And I don't know. I think there's a lot about embodied experience that is difficult to quantify because it can only really be studied subjectively. And therefore, it's not possible to measure in objective ways that gets sort of classified scientifically. That doesn't make it not real. It's an experience of embodiment that lacks a clear scientific explanation. And it seems to me that a lot of these bodywork modalities work with that strange grey area very effectively, and people get helped. And even if that was all in the mind, that still wouldn't stop it being a fantastic skill, because something has to be done to resolve the problem through the mind. So even if yoga is some enormous, kind of self-hypnotizing placebo effect, more power to it. But I don't think it is quite that simple. I think there's a lot of that involved to a certain extent. But in the sense that, we train ourselves to pay attention, that's beneficial. It calms us, and then good things can happen in the body, and we're all knotted up. All that happens is all the problems get compounded. But there is something subtler to being alive that defies explanation. It's the experience of being alive, and science has yet to explain that, whether it's in terms of the idea of consciousness or the interface of consciousness with materiality. All that science does is presume that it must arise from matter, and still can't explain it. So one way or another, it's an unanswered question. And through the body, we can pay attention to this, and that seems to be very helpful.
Well, there's two things I want to express, but I do want to be mindful of time because we are close to an hour. I don't know your time schedule.
I'm happy to chat if you're happy.
Yeah. So two things. One in regards to tradition, which is, and this is maybe the stickler in me, is saying who's and what tradition. Because first of all, when we're dealing with yoga, there's many traditions. And as we sort of said before earlier, the sort of modern postural yoga is a tradition that may not necessarily fully correspond to earlier yoga practices. So it becomes a little bit, actually it'll tie into the second sort of thought I had, which is the placebo effect, which is something I find myself a lot in, saying like, is the embodied aspect an actual placebo? And sort of thinking in terms of the chakras, right? So when I first started doing yoga, chakras were these energetic things that had the rainbow colors, like you talked about, and had these biopsychological models. Oh, your heart chakra was related to love, and your Vishuddha was related to communication or whatever. And I took those to be true, and I taught those out, and I had effects of them, and I felt those experiences. They were embodied experiences. And then I later found, studying with Christopher Wallace a bit, Harish, that actually historically that's not the case. And most of that comes out of the Theosophical Society and out of Carl Jung's, which makes sense because they're archetypes, and that's what Carl Jung is all about. So traditionally, historically, my experiences wouldn't line up with the text, yet they lined up with my experience. And it's still a place of, is it a placebo effect? Is the other a newer interpretation? I don't know. It's a constant struggle with me being both someone looking for the philosophy and also the science, which don't always go hand in hand.
No, this is it. We conduct an experiment on ourselves as practitioners, and that doesn't make the results invalid. It just makes them difficult to compare to others, and that's where science sort of draws a blank when it comes to yoga in that sense. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of continuity between what you were saying in regards to your own experience with chakras and the tradition, although the objectives are completely different. The outcomes are very similar. I'm just going to read here from the chapter on chakras in my book, from The Truth of Yoga. Tantric rituals connect mantras to elements that are pictured in the chakras, not to the chakras themselves. So reciting a seed or bija mantra linked to air is unlikely to do much to open the heart, except via placebo effects. However, focusing attention on such things can make them real, at least in the realm of subjective experience. And since this is how tantras say that deities are summoned, perhaps the use of chakras by modern practitioners is not all that different. And really, I think there's the same process going on. There's a conscious, in the modern yoga context, perhaps less conscious. People aren't aware that that's what they're doing. They're sort of programming themselves to have an experience. But there's a similar process of focusing on a place and getting subtler in perception. And the problem is that chakras have become this sort of shorthand for that subtle experience of embodiment. So everybody associates these magic effects with them. But paying attention to subtle experience is what gives the magic effect. That's just a place to anchor attention, the idea of the spinning wheel with the particular qualities and colours. And similarly, one could argue that some of the deities described in ancient tantras perhaps don't exist any more than a rainbow-coloured scheme ascending the spine. But they're metaphors for a subtler experience of reality. And the ultimate tantric explanation isn't that you've got these seeds of bits and pieces of the divine in you. It's that if you understand correctly how energy and matter relate to each other, there is nothing but oneness. And that's what's divine.
Yeah, I find sometimes that I will work with people and they might have a little bit or a lot of knowledge of that, or they'll see someone else and they'll say, oh, but during work, they might say, oh, I'm feeling a lot of sensation in my throat, or that must mean my this chakra. And I would try to say, maybe, but what do you think it means? Instead of saying you're having this experience, why are you putting someone else's information onto you, which you can take to be true, instead of exploring your own? Well, what do you think that means? Or why do you think that is? And it's, it can be difficult for some people because they're so used to being told. In fact, I get in sort of mini arguments with my fiance because she'll say, well, why don't you just lead people a little more? And I say, but my job is not to lead them. The more I lead them, it takes them away from themselves. But no, they just need a little help. And it's like, there is this fine sort of balance of how do you have your own experience without other experiences?
Wow. No, that's fantastically expressed. The whole point of yoga is the practice of inquiry. And if it's not a practice of inquiry, it's an act of mimicry or an attempt to install dogma, and that's not going to help anybody. And it's very hard to engage in inquiry. It's a very lonely and alienating thing to do because there aren't the certainties that we would like to have, and humans aren't cut out for this to a certain extent. We unless we've had a very, very skillful upbringing, spend a lot of our adult lives trying to heal childhood wounds, seeking figures of authority who we can rely on to give us the stuff that we didn't get in the first place. So we're sort of searching around ourselves for these systems of philosophy and the gurus who dispense them, who can right all our wrongs, and all we really want is the magic answer. And that's not helpful. In fact, that's how abuse is perpetrated, and how people compound their own problems. The skillful way out of that is obviously to be honest about the need to ask difficult questions and to open yourself up to what's happening. And as you expressed it, that really comes down to, what am I experiencing, rather than am I experiencing the thing that I think I should be experiencing? And that's very difficult as a teacher to communicate. To be honest, I salute you if you're getting somewhere with that project, because part of the reason I do things like still teach occasional Ashtanga classes is it's such a relief to say, well, here's the sequence. I'm going to give you some tips on how to do stuff with it. But in the end, that the sequence runs the show. You can relate to yourself through doing the sequence.
And I think, yeah, it's kind of maybe not doing the work of seeking out in itself, but it's sometimes the answer is the easy way, I think. And some people just don't, like you already said, don't have the tools yet to really go into self-inquiry and feel safe to do that. I mean, that's the other piece, is some people might do that but don't know how to relate to it, and that can be very, very scary. So I think to have like a sequence. I mean, the rolfing, we have a 10 series that is a great roadmap for if you don't know where you need to go or what to do, you do this sequence, this recipe, and you're going to find relief somewhere or another. And Ida Rolf, who created that, was to kind of help teach people to actually to become a rolfer. And there's definitely a non-formalistic way to treat the body, but I think in some ways and I realize there's a fine line of all these different yoga schools have their sequence, and
some more skillful than others.
Exactly. And I'm kind of trying to hold my thoughts here of these various different schools and how they while they're a great vehicle to start feeling into yourself and start developing that rapport with yourself, then it's tricky, because if you own it and you get it and you're taken there by a particular teacher, it's easy to become quite dogmatic, or they held the key. I think of and then they abuse these powers, but what is his name?
Which one? I mean, they're almost all of them use their powers at some point.
All of them, but the one that's been the
Bikram?
most... Bikram? Yes, Bikram.
Yeah, my goodness.
But Bikram has almost, to the best of my knowledge, has zero philosophy into his training. It's all just postures. I don't know.
That's a very good point. Yeah, no, if you watch the documentary about him on Netflix, which is a pretty good sort of, he damns himself. He doesn't need anybody to do it for him. You're right. It's all, the main thing he was interested in a lot of the time was showing people Bollywood movies rather than teaching them yoga philosophy. So I think that there's a question as to whether you actually learn anything from yoga philosophy, unless you choose to take certain lessons from it, any more than you necessarily learn anything from a physical practice, and unless you choose to orient yourself towards it in a particular way. It can be another way to either, as we talked about already, dissociate from yourself, or to gain dependence on somebody else, or just to sort of slavishly perform it in the hope that it in and of itself is going to provide magic answers. Same as going to see a therapist and waiting for them to heal you, rather than sort of understanding the whole process of talking therapy is for you to find your own answers. And I think it's very difficult in some ways to teach that, but it's helpful to remind people of it. And in writing my book, I suppose if I have one clear objective, it was to try to suggest to people that we have no choice in a sense. We are living here right now in the 21st century with all sorts of crazy ideas sometimes, no, speaking for myself, of what we think yoga is. And that's inevitable. We're not going to think like somebody who lived in a different time and place. We're certainly not going to think like the author of whatever text we've picked up and decided to start reading. So we're inevitably going to reframe it to suit our purposes. And the problem is that for many years, that process has taken place without anybody admitting it. And so even when philosophy has been taught, it has been sort of misrepresented to serve a teacher's purposes. And the example I'm thinking of is the teacher in the first tradition I studied in, BKS Iyengar, a very influential figure in the development of modern postural yoga. In fact, the whole idea of having a class in which people teach, sort of instructions for how to get into the body really developed out of his teaching. He provided a whole new language for that. And one of the reasons he came up with it was because he was funded by local government in London, in the UK, to teach potential teachers. So he was authorized to be the instructor in an adult education program, which led to the training of a lot of early UK yoga teachers, on the condition that he didn't teach any philosophy, that he just basically taught methods of keeping fit. So he put a lot of effort into trying to think about how and why the process of paying attention to a blizzard of details would be helpful from the point of view of getting you out of your head and into your body, and then suggesting things about yoga philosophy through that process. And that's quite skillful, but at the same time, anybody who's ever got hooked on Iyengar yoga, and it's a particularly niche kind of person, again, I speak for myself, usually someone who's a little bit perfectionist, perhaps a little bit masochistic, happy to have somebody, bark commands at them repeatedly and tell them, how you're not measuring up, and come back next week for more. Try and do that by yourself as a process of inquiry, and you feel lost. Well, I'm not really getting anywhere, so I'll go back to class to get a good sort of drilling from the teacher. A lot of people get stuck as a result of that, hooked on going to classes, not really sure how to teach themselves, not really having their own experience, trying to mold themselves to this supposedly perfect expression of the postures. And then you reach for Iyengar's light on yoga, and you take your pick, turn to any page and see how he's not in perfect alignment. So the whole thing's a charade in the first place. But it was just meant to be a tool, and he only ever wanted it to be that, I think, initially. But after a while of all these people hanging around, as you were alluding to, he drank his own Kool-Aid and started to think he knew everything. And the problem is also that then senior teachers systematize things. In his case, his daughter, really becoming very rigid in the sense of, this is how you do this posture. This is sort of all the bits and pieces that make it sort of the best posture. And all teachers should learn these talking points. But over the years, they were told different talking points, and some of them are completely contradictory, and they were really supposed to just be useful in any given moment. And the best teachers understood that and teach that way, but most teachers become dogmatic, and then they also revere the guru, who is the source of all knowledge, and that doesn't lead anywhere that helpful from the point of view of this individual inquiry.
No, I mean, it's funny. I worry that anyone who's an Ashtangi or a Iyengar would think we're picking on them. And it's obviously not 100% of the time. And there's nothing wrong with these practices. But I always struggled with both of them because they seem so extreme. And to me, yoga really meant finding quote unquote balance, and balance is about adaptability, about being with what is. And so they always struggled with them a lot for that. And like you said, there are certain, it was interesting when you look at the certain type of people who would find it. And for me, studying more into Ayurvedic and looking at the sort of Ayurvedic mind and saying, oh, well, the people who have more of this quote unquote dosha will like fit more in it, and really seeing it play out. But I think about, to go back to something Nikki was saying about rolfing, Ida Rolf. Ida was a big fan of, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, but Alfred Korzybski, who, and brought that into it. And while she did give this framework of the recipe, it was suggested, but never saying, do exactly this, because the map is not the territory, is what Korzybski was saying. And I think that falls really well into yoga too, if you can bring that into it, where you teach people and you say, these are ideas. This is what we think should be. This is a map of it. But life doesn't follow a map, right? At least we can't see that. And that life is moving, and the map is a two-dimensional object of a picture of something that isn't actually the thing. And so when we can learn the methods, but also have this adaptability principle of like, do these postures, these structures for this, when it seems right, when it seems correct.
Absolutely. And that's, that requires a certain amount of training and an understanding, and also an interest in autonomy. But assuming all those things are in place, I think there are now many more sophisticated models for working with the body than there were 50 years ago when Westerners started big time getting into yoga. And associating really the practice of asana with the idea of yoga, because for most of yoga's history, yoga has been meditation. That's the real meaning of the concept, is concentration training and understanding who we really are as a result. Asana just being a preparatory vehicle for that practice. But now that asana has become an end into itself, it can still be a helpful tool. But there's an increasing refinement of teaching techniques. But there's also, as a result of this sort of, I guess, attempt to get away from the extremes. And you're right, both of those schools are quite extreme in the sense that they're both quite dogmatic. If you disagree with a few fundamental things, you're not welcome in most people's classes.
You might get hit first and then kicked out.
Yeah, I mean, I've had these things happen to me, and those are still the two biggest influences on my own personal practice. I found them both very helpful, but only once I realised that I needed to take a little bit more charge of my own approach rather than expect somebody else to be in charge of my own body. But at the same time, this sort of reaction to that has bred an idea almost that we shouldn't really teach anybody anything, because Pattabhi Jois abused some of his students. The idea of physical adjustments is a horrendous thing that we should never subject anybody to. We might injure them, never mind assault them. Therefore, we should actually encourage people to come into a space and approximate a shape, find what feels good, basically. And then there's a whole sort of promotion of that idea about teaching these days as a reaction against extremes, and to suggest there is no perfect shape. Basically do a 5 rhythms dance.
Which is great. I love 5 rhythms.
I mean, it's cool, but it's a different thing. The whole point of yoga is it's a discipline. And so you have to, Patanjali in his Yoga Sutra makes that absolutely clear. Tapas, this concept, that's the anchor of it all. So you can take it to extremes, tapas, self-discipline, self-mortification, if you really want to go too far with it. But, a little bit of cultivation of focus is necessary. And so a framework is helpful. But if you can't freestyle on the framework, basically, if you can't play jazz after learning all those scales, then what's the point of learning them?
Yeah. So let me ask you this as a way to also sort of wind down. People wanting to find more about yoga and find out more about you, would you say that what you're offering is for everyone, or is it more for people who have done an initiative step, whether it's a 200-hour or 100 or done a little exploring? Do you think it's necessary for people sort of, I had a call with a friend yesterday who's looking to get quote unquote more spiritual, get more into like the yoga world. And I was saying, like, do a 200-hour training. It's going to be largely like historically incorrect, but you're going to need that in order to you need to kind of fall back in order to open the perspective in order to go forward. Maybe I'm inaccurate on that. How do you see that? How do you see yourself in that?
Well, I mean, I've written my book, The Truth of Yoga, as ideally, I suppose, a 200-hour teacher training course book. It covers the things that most, I mean, I teach on teacher training, some of them of that variety, some of them, a lot more in depth. I teach on one at Tri Yoga in London where we do, I think, 64 hours of philosophy and history. So it's a lot more than the Yoga Alliance says you should do. But whatever the framework, I think what I've tried to present there is accessible enough that if you've got an interest in finding things out, then it's going to be user friendly. But obviously, that interest has to be there. And you're right in some ways that the determinant of that level of interest usually is wanting to go further than what's on offer in classes, retreats, workshops, whatever it is. And there's not really anything else other than teacher training. And one of the things I would like to develop, contribute to, encourage is an alternative model. We don't need any more yoga teachers. There's far too many already. There's lots of bad ones as well. What we really need is a new framework whereby people can be encouraged to take practice seriously, learn to develop your own practice, become an autonomous yoga practitioner who can then draw on the rich knowledge of other teachers by studying with them from time to time, but can be a bit more self-directing. And part of that process would be to learn some yoga history and philosophy because it helps you to own your own practice. So I wrote my book from that point of view, hoping people could see how that's happened over time, and that's all that they can do now is to decide whether they want a relationship with this stuff or not. And if they do, here's an accessible entry point. But it will still, you're right, seem to some people daunting. There's a lot of information, a lot of ideas. Even if it is relatively accessible, it's still above the level some people are looking for. Some people want to read, Anna Diarjudi's books about spinning wheels of magic colors that will summon archangels and suits of the tarot into your life if you just place your attention in the right part of the body. I can't stop that, and I don't intend to. But I guess I see myself as offering a stepping stone for people who would like to find out more, but aren't interested in serious scholars. There's a lot now of accessible yoga scholarship available on the internet. You can, take courses with some of the world's leading experts. And I'm offering now online courses at my site, truthofyoga.com, which don't really aspire to do that. I'm not trying to bring, the latest yoga scholarship to people in scholarly form. I'm trying to glean the insight from those experts that is most relevant to a modern yoga practitioner, not even necessarily a teacher, and then explain traditional texts from that perspective. I've got a course initially that's based around the ideas in my book, trying to summarize history and philosophy in 4 modules. But I'll also then go on to look at the main yoga texts. And again, hopefully that would be accessible to anybody, whether they've got prior training or not. We'll start assuming no knowledge, but we'll hopefully take people to a place where they could then go and engage with really serious stuff should they want to. And ideally, they'll at least know what it is to be wrong and to want not to be wrong.
We'll link that up you can send me later the link for that course. And I'll share that. There's a great course I took out of, I think, Yoga Campus, which is through SOAS, and it has like the people you're talking about. Yeah. And it's a great course, but I mean, some of them when they're talking, it's just they're like you said, the scholars debate with each other, and they don't always have that ability to talk normal.
They've got a vested interest, in a way. If you stop speaking that way, you might at the wrong moment not come out with the scholarliness when your career hangs on it. After 20 years of training yourself to see the world that way, that's just how you speak. It's just inevitable. Whereas, I guess I'm fortunate. I spend most of my time talking to yoga teachers, yoga practitioners, rather than to scholars. So I'm sort of more going the other way. And that's my aspiration. But yeah, there's lots of good courses out there, and I don't want to talk them down. But I do want to acknowledge that they do assume a certain level of commitment.
For sure. And I think the way I understand you to communicate and to express is wonderful. And it really finds that way where you can have history, you can have tradition, you can have knowledge, but you don't have to speak at a higher register.
It's not for eggheads, basically. It's the anti-egghead yoga scholarship.
Which is no pun about yoga having to do with yoking, right? No egghead, no yoke.
Well, no, indeed, and I mean, ultimately, I suppose I am a bit of an egghead. I guess I'm trying to be geeky in a helpful way. That's my current sort of mantra for why I do what I do.
Well, I haven't read the book, but from hearing from y'all talking about it, it seems like it's a great foundation for someone to be able to sift through any potential BS or be able to enter into the truth telling with the tradition without having to, which might be, it sounds like a great savior in the sense of keeping people from not becoming too involved in a dogmatic practice or attached to a teacher. And I mean, for me, that's kind of been a little bit of a turnoff through some of the schools that I've attended, is like you almost become fearful to have your own self-inquiry and to challenge what so-and-so is saying, because then you're like pointed out as like, you don't know what you're doing or you're not doing it right. And who wants to feel that way, especially when you're in a place of wanting to be in touch and to feel good.
Of course. And if it's a sincere process of inquiry, you have to ask questions. And I guess that's become my yardstick. The teacher doesn't like questions too much, then time to find a different teacher. And part of what I try to do is encourage people to ask questions and to do my best to sit with whatever comes up when people are answering each other's questions as well. And not to try and make anybody wrong necessarily, even if there's something that's actually incorrect in what they've said, to try and help people see for themselves how to find the right answers. Because that's what, coming back to what Andrew was saying, that's what yoga practice is about. And we've got the problem of not seeing clearly, depending on somebody else to provide right answers, or even to come up with the concept of right and wrong, is not going to be very helpful for that process of cultivating discernment. We've got to be able to distinguish the difference for ourselves. So yeah, exactly. You've summed up better than I could. In fact, my aspiration in a way to give people some tools for that process.
And Nikki, to sort of echo what you're saying, right now, when I meet people and they say, well, what yoga books should I read if I really want to go deeper? I would say Roots of Yoga by Jim Ellison, but it's amazing. It's got tons of information, but it's not practical for a lot of people. So it gives them what they need. So that's one. And now Truth of Yoga, because what Daniel's offering is really that wonderful way in between. It has much of the same information, but it's written in a way that you can read, you can take part in it. It's not just a translation of. So it's really great for that.
Cards on the table, to come back to where we started. I studied with those guys, with Mark and Jim, and they're world authorities, and hats off to them. And I could not have written what I've written had they not done all the work that they've done. But as you acknowledge, I've recommended that book to so many people over the last 3 years, 4 years even now, I guess it is. And so many have struggled to read it. And so I decided in a way that there was a need actually for something to help people to be in a position to read that book. I've run, an online workshop where we read through Roots of Yoga, a chapter at a time, with a study group week by week. And it is accessible enough that with a bit of support, people can help themselves to do that, but it takes some assistance, because there's just so much assumed knowledge. It's a wonderful reference text, but without a good foundation, you'd struggle with it. And my hope is that my book provides enough of a foundation that somebody could actually start to dip into a book like Roots of Yoga and not feel lost, at least. And that's
totally. It totally does. I had heard you on a talk before the book came out, and I was so impressed that I pre-ordered the book, which I never do. And I even referred your book for people to pre-order, having never read it, which is something I usually won't recommend, something I haven't actually experienced, but was so impressed with it that I wanted other people to do it. And it's now become that book where if people are saying, hey, I want to go further, I can say this has information and it has validity. Like you said, Anodea Judith's book is great if you want to bypass, but it doesn't have validity. It doesn't have validity there. It doesn't have the historical validity. Whereas your book has that. And what I love most about it is that it's funny. There's something lighthearted, because I don't probably come off today as someone who's funny. And if you ask my partner, I'm never funny, but I enjoy that sense of lightheartedness. I think that that's one of the things that's, if you were to go back into some of the practices we've mentioned, they're missing that levity. It's such a, yoga becomes so serious where it's like, but no, like yoga is everything. So therefore we need to have levity. We need to have lightness in it. We don't want to be too light and we don't want to be too strict. We're adapting those all the time. And the way that you write brings that through clearly. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And I will say that one video that, I apologize as an extent of research that I did on you before the podcast. But it was, I thought that little 1 minute video made me want to buy the book. And it's not really on my want list to like further study into the tradition of yoga, but it sparked enough interest and it felt tangible, and the humor that I picked up on because for me, I was like, I could probably get into this if it's has some humor and it's not so heavy with and no disrespect to the history, but I've been homeschooling 2 kids through this pandemic, so easy info. And so yes, I'm excited to look into the book and to read it because it feels digestible and with humor.
Oh, thank you both. No, I mean, that's my aspiration. My journalistic training was such that, if you can't keep the reader entertained after a couple of paragraphs, they're going to flip the page, click the link, whatever it may be. So hopefully these bits and pieces are small enough, digestible enough that, you keep the book in the bathroom and dip into it once in a while there. You don't need to read it cover to cover. It's got material to spark some interest each time.
Yeah,
you pick it up.
it's a nice thing about it. I mean, I'm reading it cover to cover, but you could pick it up and say, oh, I'm curious about this topic. And you don't need to necessarily have read the previous in order to get the information, which is great. So, people can find your book wherever books are. Well, I don't know about wherever books are sold, but most places books are sold. Yeah. In the US, Amazon has it. And other most booksellers. We should support local booksellers and all over the world. You can find, I'm sure you can order directly from your website.
Bookshop.org, I think, is a sort of anti-Amazon. They have it definitely, and all booksellers will be able to order it if they don't have it in stock. And you can all find out more at truthofyoga.com. That's the easiest one-stop shop.
Is there anything else you want to share? Anything else people should know about you before we sign off?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. I'd just like to thank you both for a really wonderful chat. It's been really thought-provoking for me to just sort of come back to the basic questions of why do we do this stuff and what's the point of it, and also to acknowledge that while yoga has got this sort of long established tradition, it doesn't mean it's got all the answers. It's some helpful tools, but it's only a partial solution to the problem of being an embodied human in the 21st century, and it can modern yoga teaching and practice can learn from other approaches to the mind-body conundrum.
Yeah, well, thank you, Daniel. It's been awesome for us. I look forward to being more in touch with you. And thank you for your time, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you both.
We'll see you around. Ciao.
Take care. Yeah, thanks again. Bye-bye. Enjoy the rest of the day.
You too. Bye.
Thanks for listening to us at Touching Into Presence. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can find out more about Daniel at danielsimpson.info and truthofyoga.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast and subscribe to it through the platform of your choice. When you do this, it really helps other people find us, and we greatly appreciate your support. We look forward to hearing back from you and seeing you on our next conversation at Touching Into Presence. Bye-bye.